The pool had been the jewel of the property when Mark bought the house 3 years ago. A sparkling, kidney-shaped oasis framed by pristine concrete and a small, charming deck. It was the reason he'd stretched his budget to the breaking point, envisioning tranquil summer afternoons floating peacefully with a cold drink in hand. He imagined quiet weekend barbecues with a few close friends, the gentle lapping of water serving as a soothing soundtrack to his new life. The reality, however, had been anything but tranquil. The pool had become a public utility, a free-for-all, water park for his next-door neighbor, Carol. At first, it had been subtle. A week after he moved in, Carol had popped her head over the 6-foot vinyl fence that separated their properties. "Oh, a pool! How lovely!" she'd chirped, her smile wide but her eyes sharp, analytical. "My kids, Jason and Emily, are just going to be thrilled. We haven't had a pool next door in years." Mark, wanting to be a good neighbor, had offered a friendly, non-committal smile. "Yeah, it's nice." That Saturday, the invasion began. He was in his kitchen making coffee when he heard a loud splash. Peeking through the blinds, he saw 2 preteen kids who he assumed were Jason and Emily, cannonballing into the deep end. Carol was setting up towels on his lounge chairs as if she owned them. She saw him at the window and gave a breezy wave. "Hope you don't mind. It's just so hot today," she yelled, her voice carrying an assumption of permission. Mark, flustered and socially awkward by nature, didn't know what to do. He didn't want to start a conflict in his first month. He gave a weak wave back and retreated from the window, his stomach churning with anxiety. He spent the rest of the day hiding inside, listening to the shrieks and splashes from his own backyard, feeling like an intruder in his own home. This became the pattern. Carol never asked. She and her family, and soon her friends, simply appeared. They'd used the side gate, which Mark had foolishly left unlocked once, and now treated as a public entrance. They brought their own garish, inflatable monstrosities, a giant pink flamingo, a wobbly unicorn, and left them floating in the water. They ate their snacks on his deck, leaving a trail of sticky popsicle wrappers and greasy potato chip bags. His carefully curated oasis had become Carol's personal resort. The financial toll was just as draining as the emotional one. His water bills skyrocketed from refilling the pool after their splash fights. The chemical balance was perpetually off, forcing him to spend hundreds on chlorine, shock, and algicide. The pool filter, designed for light residential use, whined and groaned under the strain, eventually dying an expensive death. Mark had to replace the entire pump system, a $2,000 expense he hadn't budgeted for. When he'd tried to broach the topic of cost sharing, Carol had laughed it off. "Oh, Mark, don't be silly," she'd said, adjusting the straps on her swimsuit. "It's your pool. That's a homeowner's expense. Besides, think of all the joy it brings." The joy it brought was exclusively hers. For Mark, it was a source of constant, simmering resentment. He found himself dreading sunny days. He stopped inviting his own friends over, too embarrassed to explain the bizarre squatter situation in his backyard. His dream of peaceful afternoons had been replaced by the grating reality of kids screaming Marco Polo and Carol gossiping loudly on her phone from his favorite lounge chair. The breaking point came on a blistering Tuesday in late July. Mark was working from home on a crucial video conference with a potential client. He had closed all the windows, but the noise from the backyard was still bleeding through. Carol was hosting what sounded like a neighborhood-wide pool party. At least a dozen people were out there. The music was blasting and someone was trying to do a belly flop that shook the very foundation of the house. "Is everything all right there, Mark?" the client asked, a frown creasing his forehead. "Sounds like you're at a frat party." Mortified, Mark stammered an apology about neighborhood noise and quickly wrapped up the call, knowing he'd blown the deal. Fury, cold and sharp, pierced through his usual passive demeanor. He stormed to the back door, yanked it open, and stepped out onto the deck. The scene was worse than he'd imagined. His lawn was littered with empty beer cans. A wet dog, not his own, was shaking itself dry near his prized rose bushes. Carol, holding court in the center of the chaos, was pouring a margarita from a blender plugged into his outdoor outlet. "Carol!" Mark's voice was tighter than a guitar string. She turned, a look of mild surprise on her face. "Oh, hi, Mark! Done with work already? Grab a drink!" "Everybody out," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Now!" The laughter and music trickled to a halt. All eyes turned to him. Carol's smile faltered, replaced by a sneer. "Excuse me? What is your problem?" "My problem is that this is my house, my pool, and my electricity. This party is over. I want every single person who I did not personally invite off my property in the next 5 minutes." A heavy, awkward silence fell. Carol's friends began gathering their things, avoiding eye contact. Carol, however, stood her ground, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "There is no need to be so dramatic. We're just having a little fun." "I'm not having fun," Mark shot back. "I'm paying for it. Get out." Carol stared him down for a long moment, her eyes filled with a venom that shocked him. She finally grabbed her things, herded her children, and stalked toward the side gate. Before she left, she turned back, her voice dripping with malice. "You're going to regret this, Mark. You've just made a very big mistake." He watched them go, his heart pounding, but a strange sense of exhilaration washed over him. He had finally taken his yard back. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at his computer, researching, and by dawn he had made a decision. He wasn't just taking his yard back. He was taking the entire problem off the map. 2 weeks later, the demolition crew arrived. The sound of the jackhammers was glorious, a symphony of liberation. The crew was efficient, breaking apart the concrete deck and tearing out the fiberglass shell of the pool. It took 2 days of relentless, grinding noise. Mark happily endured it, watching from his kitchen window as the source of his misery was systematically dismantled and hauled away in massive trucks. By the 3rd day, a dump truck arrived and began filling the gaping wound in his yard with load after load of rich, dark earth. He hadn't seen or heard from Carol since their confrontation. Her side of the fence remained unnervingly quiet. Mark assumed she was stewing, perhaps plotting some petty revenge like leaving a bag of dog poop on his porch. He vastly underestimated her capacity for delusion. On the 4th morning, Mark stood in his backyard looking at the fresh, level patch of dirt. It was ugly, a muddy scar on the landscape, but to him, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. He was already planning what he'd do with the space. A large vegetable garden, maybe a fire pit, a small patio where he could sit in peace. He took a deep, clean breath, free of the cloying scent of chlorine for the first time in years. That's when he heard it. A sound so full of anguish and rage, it was barely human. "No!" He turned toward the fence. Carol was standing on her own deck, peering over the top of the fence, her hands clutching the vinyl slats. Her face was a mask of utter horror and disbelief, as if she had just witnessed a murder. "What? What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "What did you do?" "I removed my pool, Carol," Mark said calmly, feeling a surge of satisfaction. Your pool? Your pool?" She laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "That was our pool. That was for the children. It was for the neighborhood. How could you be so selfish?" "It was on my property. I paid for its upkeep, and I decided I didn't want it anymore," Mark said, his voice flat and final. He turned to, "Go back inside, considering the conversation over." "You can't do that!" she screamed, her voice rising in pitch and volume. "That's destruction of property. That lowers my property value. You had no right. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to call the police." Mark paused at his back door and looked back at her. "Go ahead, Carol. Call them." He closed the door behind him, his hand trembling slightly. He had expected anger, not this complete psychotic break. He went to the living room, his heart still, thumping, and peered through the front curtains. 10 minutes later, just as he knew they would, 2 police cruisers, lights flashing, pulled up to the curb. One parked in front of his house, the other in front of Carol's. Mark watched as Carol, having thrown on a sundress to appear more respectable, practically ran to the first officer, a tall, weary-looking man named Officer Davis. She was a whirlwind of frantic gestures and crocodile tears. Mark couldn't hear her exact words, but he could see her pointing wildly at his house, her body language screaming victimhood. After a few minutes of her dramatic performance, Officer Davis and his younger partner, Officer Chen, walked up Mark's driveway. Mark opened the door before they could knock. "Good morning, officers," he said politely. "Sir, we've received a call from your neighbor," Officer Davis began, his expression neutral. "She's alleging that you've illegally destroyed a shared community asset and have been making threats against her." Mark blinked. A shared community asset? Threats? The sheer audacity was breathtaking. "She's mistaken," he said simply. "May I show you?" He led them through his house to the back door and opened it, revealing the vast expanse of newly filled earth. From across the fence, Carol was watching them, a smug, triumphant look on her face. The color drained from Carol's face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of terror. The world, which a moment before had been her stage, shrank to the space between her and the grim-faced police officer holding the pen. Her smug certainty evaporated, replaced by the frantic, sputtering engine of a mind trying to reverse course at high speed. I never said that," she stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. "The dispatcher must have misheard me. I was upset. He was yelling." "The 911 calls are recorded, ma'am," Officer Davis said, his tone devoid of sympathy. He clicked the pen, a sound that echoed with finality in the quiet afternoon. "Every word. You alleged a felony threat that mobilizes a priority response. It puts officers and the public at risk. We don't take that lightly." Officer Chen, who had been silent, stepped forward. "We need you to come down to the station." "The station? What for?" Carol's eyes darted wildly between the 2 officers, then shot a look of pure, unadulterated hatred at Mark, who was still standing by his back door, watching the scene unfold. It was his fault, all of it. "We need to take your official statement," Officer Davis said, though it wasn't a request. "And you'll be issued a citation. You'll have a court date. I'd advise you to get a lawyer." He gestured for her to come down from her deck. For a moment it looked as if she might refuse, might barricade herself in her home, but the steely look in the officer's eyes broke her resolve. Defeated, Carol shuffled down her deck stairs and was escorted to one of the cruisers. She didn't look at Mark again. She didn't have to. The promise of retribution radiated from her like heat from asphalt. As the police cars pulled away, a profound silence settled over the cul-de-sac. Mark retreated into his house, his legs feeling weak. He had won the battle, but he knew with a chilling certainty that the war had just begun. Carol was not the type to learn a lesson. She was the type to double down. The next few weeks were deceptively quiet. A for sale sign appeared on the lawn of the family who had been Carol's primary allies in the pool parties. Mark received a few sympathetic nods from other neighbors who had likely witnessed the police encounter. He spent his time planning his garden, sketching out raised beds and ordering seeds. The large patch of dirt in his backyard, which he'd started calling the blank slate, was a symbol of his newfound peace. He tilled the soil, mixed in compost, and felt the knot of anxiety in his stomach slowly begin to unwind. His peace was shattered by a crisp, cream-colored envelope in his mailbox embossed with the logo of the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association. He slid it open with a sense of dread. Inside, a single sheet of paper informed him, in sterile, bureaucratic language, that he was in violation of Bylaw 74.2, Landscaping and Aesthetic Maintenance. The letter stated that a significant portion of the backyard landscape has been reduced to bare earth, which is an aesthetic blight on the community. He was given 30 days to rectify the situation by submitting a comprehensive landscaping plan for approval and beginning installation. Failure to comply would result in a fine of $100 per day. Mark read the letter twice. An aesthetic blight? It was dirt. It was going to be a garden. He looked at the bottom of the letter to see who had filed the complaint. It was, of course, anonymous. But he knew. This was Carol's new weapon. She couldn't use the police, so she had turned to the next best thing. The quasi-fascist regime of the suburban HOA. Mark spent that evening poring over the 3-inch thick binder of HOA covenants and restrictions he'd received when he bought the house. It was a labyrinth of legal jargon and petty tyrannies, rules for mailbox colors, for the exact angle of driveway basketball hoops, for the acceptable species of decorative shrubbery. And there it was, 7.4.2, as vague and menacing as the letter had suggested. But he also found bylaw 7.9.1. Vegetable gardens are permitted with prior approval of the Architectural Review Committee, provided they are not visible from the street and are maintained in a neat and orderly fashion. He had a loophole. The next morning, he drafted a detailed landscaping plan. He drew a scale map of his yard, marking the precise locations for 3 large raised garden beds, a stone pathway, and a small flagstone patio with a fire pit. He included a list of all the plants he intended to grow, tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, herbs, and attached pictures from gardening magazines to show what a neat and orderly vegetable garden looked like. He submitted the entire package to the HOA, feeling a small spark of triumph. He was playing by the rules. Her attack had failed. A week later, his plan was rejected. The reason given was infuriatingly vague. The proposed plan does not meet the aesthetic standards of the community. The scale of the bare earth elements, the garden beds, is too large. Please revise and resubmit. The letter was signed by the head of the Architectural Review Committee, a man named Bob Vance, who, Mark happened to know, lived 2 doors down from Carol and was a regular at her weekend barbecues. The game was rigged. Mark revised the plan. He made the beds smaller and added more decorative elements. Ornamental grasses, a bird bath. He resubmitted it, rejected again. Insufficient ground cover. The plan relies too heavily on seasonal plantings, which will result in bare earth during the off-season. It was a war of attrition. Every rejection cost him time, moving him closer to the 30-day deadline and the crippling daily fines. He felt a rising tide of panic. He was being methodically, bureaucratically choked. Carol, meanwhile, was a ghost. He never saw her come or go, but he felt her presence constantly. He'd see her shadow in a window when he went to get the mail. He'd hear her dog start barking the moment he stepped into his backyard. She was watching, waiting, savoring his slow-motion torment. His only reprieve was the work itself. He refused to let the patch of earth lie fallow. Even without an approved plan, he could prepare the area. He bought lumber for the raised beds and began cutting and assembling them in his garage. He ordered a truckload of gravel for the pathway. He was going to build his garden, with or without their permission. If the fines came, he would fight them. He would not be driven out by paperwork. One Saturday afternoon, while he was hauling bags of topsoil from his truck, a neighbor from across the street, a quiet woman named Sarah, came over. "Building a garden?" she asked, eyeing the stack of lumber in his driveway. "Trying to," Mark grunted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The HOA isn't making it easy." Sarah lowered her voice. "I know. Carol has been telling everyone you're trying to build some kind of dirt farm to lower property values. She's been canvassing, collecting signatures for a petition to have the HOA force you to install sod." Mark froze, a bag of soil halfway to his shoulder. "A petition? Are you serious?" She's telling people you're unstable, Sarah continued, looking genuinely concerned. She's twisting the story about the police, saying you threatened her and the cops did nothing and that everyone needs to watch out. A few people are buying it. Bob Vance, obviously. But most of us know what she's like. We saw how her family treated your pool. The news was a gut punch. It wasn't just a secret war between him and Carol anymore. She was poisoning the well, turning the entire neighborhood against him. He was being painted as the villain, the unstable pariah, all because he'd had the audacity to reclaim his own property. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamed of weeds, thick, thorny vines erupting from the blank slate, creeping across his yard, strangling his house. He woke up in a cold sweat, the phrase aesthetic blight echoing in his head. The next morning, he found another cream-colored envelope in his mailbox. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the city's code enforcement office. His hands shook as he opened it. A new complaint. This time, it alleged that he was running a commercial construction business out of his garage, citing the excessive noise from power tools and the storage of commercial building materials, his lumber and bags of soil in his driveway. It was a complete fabrication. He'd used a circular saw twice in the middle of the day on a Saturday. He knew Carol's fingerprints were all over it. She was opening a new front. If the HOA couldn't stop him, she would use the city. She would bury him in violations, real or imagined, until he was broken. Mark looked from the letter in his hand toward Carol's house. Through her front window, he could just make out her silhouette, still and watchful. The quiet suburban street felt like a battlefield. The green lawns, the cheerful flower beds, the neatly painted houses, it was all a facade. Underneath, it was trenches and barbed wire. His 30-day deadline with the HOA was 3 days away. His third landscape design had been sitting in their pending queue for a week. The first $100 fine was about to hit, and he knew it would be just the beginning. The city violation required a response within 10 days. The walls were closing in. He sank down onto his front step, the 2 letters clutched in his hand, feeling the weight of a multi-front war he had never asked for. He had gotten rid of the pool, the source of the problem, but the problem hadn't been the pool. It had been Carol. And Carol was still there, right across the fence, relentless and patient. He was staring at the blank slate in his backyard, the source of all his current misery, when a new idea began to form. It was a desperate, risky, and possibly insane idea. The HOA wanted ground cover. They wanted something that wasn't bare earth. They wanted something. The dump truck arrived at precisely 8 a.m. the next morning. It was a lumbering, grime-covered beast of a vehicle, and its brakes hissed like an angry dragon as it positioned itself at the end of Mark's driveway. With a deafening groan of hydraulics, the truck's bed tilted upward, and a tidal wave of raw, unprocessed wood chips cascaded onto the concrete. It wasn't just a pile. It was a mountain. 10 cubic yards was an abstract number on the phone. But in reality, it was a jagged, multi-toned heap of shredded trees that consumed nearly half of his 2-car driveway. It smelled of sap and sawdust and damp earth. It was chaotic, ugly, and utterly defiant. Mark stood in his open garage, a wheelbarrow and a shovel at the ready, and felt a grim smile touch his lips. This was his statement. It was a 10 cubic yard middle finger to the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association. He hadn't even scooped his first shovelful before he heard the shriek from next door. "What is that?" Carol was on her second-story balcony, a coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips. She stared at the monstrous pile of wood chips as if a meteorite had landed. Her face cycled through confusion, disgust, and then a dawning, furious comprehension. "You can't do that!" she screamed, her voice echoing across the sleepy morning street. "That is a violation! That is industrial waste!" Mark ignored her. He plunged his shovel into the heap, the rough texture of the wood chips scraping against the metal. He filled the wheelbarrow, the muscles in his back and shoulders already protesting. He wheeled the first load around the side of his house and dumped it onto the corner of the blank slate. One load down, approximately 150 to go. By the time he returned to the driveway, Carol was on her phone, pacing her lawn and gesticulating wildly at his house. He didn't need to hear the words to know she was calling her allies. He shoveled another load and another. He fell into a rhythm. Scoop, lift, push, dump, return. It was mindless, back-breaking work, and it was exactly what he needed. Every bead of sweat was a small victory, a physical manifestation of his refusal to be broken by petty bureaucracy. An hour into his labor, a pristine black SUV pulled up to the curb. Bob Vance, the head of the Architectural Review Committee, emerged. He was a portly man in his late 50s, dressed in a polo shirt and khaki shorts, an outfit that tried to project casual authority but only succeeded in looking pompous. He marched up the driveway, his face a thundercloud. "Mark," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "what is the meaning of this?" He gestured to the mountain of wood chips as if it were a dead body. "Morning, Bob," Mark said, leaning on his shovel and wiping his brow with the back of his glove. "This is ground cover. As you know, the HOA cited me for having bare earth. I'm rectifying the situation." Bob's eyes narrowed. "This is not acceptable landscaping material. This is refuse." "Is it?" Mark asked, his tone deceptively mild. He pulled a folded, dirt-smudged piece of paper from his back pocket. It was a printout from the HOA's own website, from the approved landscaping materials page he had found after 3 hours of searching the night before. Because according to Addendum C subsection 8 of the landscaping guidelines, natural wood chips or mulch are listed as an approved ground cover for non-lawn areas. Doesn't specify the type or quality, just natural wood chips. Bob stared at the paper, momentarily speechless. He clearly had no idea that clause existed. "Well, this is an excessive quantity, and you haven't received approval for this installation. Your committee rejected my 3 previous plans for being aesthetically unacceptable and for containing too much bare earth," Mark countered, his voice hardening. "This plan has 0 bare earth. The entire area will be covered. As for the quantity, the violation notice didn't specify a limit, only that the blight be rectified. And as for this pile," he gestured to the mountain, "it's a temporary material delivery. I plan to have it moved by the end of the day." Bob was sputtering, his face turning a blotchy red. He was a bully who operated through paperwork and intimidation, and he was completely unprepared for someone who had not only read the rules but was using them as a weapon against him. "You're creating a nuisance, Mark. Look at this mess. I'm writing you up for this. You'll be fined." "Go ahead," Mark said, turning his back on Bob and plunging his shovel back into the pile. "I'm sure my lawyer will be very interested to see how the HOA fines a resident for complying with a violation notice using pre-approved materials." The mention of a lawyer was the final blow. Bob stood there for a moment, impotent and fuming, then spun on his heel and stomped back to his SUV. As he drove off, Mark saw Carol watching from her window, her arms crossed, a look of disbelief on her face. Round 1 had gone to him. He kept working. The sun climbed higher, beating down on his neck. His t-shirt was soaked through with sweat, and his hands were beginning to blister despite the gloves. Neighbors on their morning walks would slow down, staring at the spectacle of the lone man battling the wood chip mountain. Some shook their heads in disapproval. But then Sarah from across the street came over with 2 bottles of cold water. "You're a madman," she said, but she was smiling. "And it's brilliant." "Thanks," Mark breathed, gratefully chugging half a bottle. "I'm just following the rules." "We all know whose rules you're following," she said, glancing toward Carol's house. "Let me know if you need help." Her small act of solidarity was like a shot of adrenaline. He wasn't entirely alone. Around noon, a white city-owned sedan pulled up. The code enforcement officer who got out was a different one this time, a woman with a no-nonsense expression. She had a clipboard in her hand. Carol, seeing her arrival, practically materialized on the lawn next door, ready to provide her witness. "Testimony." "Sir," the officer said, approaching Mark, "we've received a complaint about an illegal dumping of commercial waste and a public right-of-way obstruction." "It's not waste, it's landscaping material," Mark said, repeating his now well-rehearsed lines. "And it's on my private property, not the public right-of-way. My driveway." The officer looked at the pile, then at the sidewalk and the street. "It's not blocking the sidewalk," she conceded, "but it does constitute a potential hazard. You can't just store this here indefinitely." "I don't plan to," Mark replied. "This was delivered this morning, and as you can see, I am actively in the process of moving it to my backyard. I expect to be finished by nightfall." From across the property, "Line," Carol chimed in. "He's lying! He's going to leave that eyesore there forever just to spite me!" The officer gave Carol a brief, irritated glance before turning back to Mark. She seemed to assess his sweat-drenched clothes, the growing empty space on the driveway, and the filled wheelbarrow. "You have until 6 p.m. tomorrow to have this driveway completely clear," she said. "If it's still here when I come back, you'll get a citation." "Understood," Mark said. "It'll be gone." The officer nodded, made a note on her clipboard, and left. Carol was left standing on her lawn, fuming that Mark hadn't been handcuffed and dragged away on the spot. Another bullet dodged. The rest of the day was a blur of grueling, repetitive motion. His body screamed in protest. His shoulders, his back, his legs, every muscle ached with a deep, burning fire. But he kept going, fueled by spite and cold water. As the sun began to set, the mountain on the driveway had dwindled to a small mound, and the blank slate in the back was gone, replaced by a sprawling, lumpy carpet of raw wood chips. It was hideous. It looked like the floor of a hamster cage the size of a tennis court. It was an aesthetic nightmare. And it was perfect. He shoveled the last load as dusk settled, his arms trembling with exhaustion. He swept the driveway clean of every last stray chip, put his tools away, and then stood at his back door, surveying his creation. He had done it. He had complied. He heard a slow, deliberate clap from the other side of the fence. He turned to see Carol standing on her deck, a glass of wine in her hand. Her face was illuminated by her porch light, and her expression was a chilling mixture of fury and amusement. "Bravo, Mark." "Bravo," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've won." "I'm just a guy who wants to be left alone, Carol," he said, his voice raspy with fatigue. "Oh, you'll be left alone," she sneered, taking a sip of wine. "You'll be so alone in this house you won't know what to do with yourself. You think a pile of wood chips is going to stop me? You think Bob is your only problem?" She took a step, closer to the fence, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Bob is just a useful idiot, but I have friends on the main board. I sit on the community events committee with the wife of the HOA president. We have brunch, we talk. And we've been talking a lot about you, Mark. About the unstable man who is dragging our neighborhood's reputation through the mud." Mark stood, frozen, a cold dread seeping into his bones, overriding his physical exhaustion. This was worse than he thought. It wasn't just Carol and her lackey, it was systemic. "By the time we're done," Carol continued, her eyes glittering with manic glee, "you'll have so many fines, so many liens on this property you'll have to sell. And Bob and I will make sure the architectural committee rejects every offer you get from any family with kids. We'll make sure the only person who can afford to buy this place at a discount is a quiet, single developer who has no interest in, say, a garden. You've made an enemy of—" Mark didn't move a muscle. He let the silence hang in the air, a stark contrast to the venomous tirade Carol had just unleashed. He watched her triumphant smile, the way she savored what she believed was his utter and complete defeat. She finished. Her whine, with a theatrical gulp, shot him one last look of pure contempt, and then turned and disappeared into her house, the sliding glass door shutting with a soft click. Only then did Mark bend down, his exhausted body protesting every inch of the movement, and retrieve his phone. His thumb, trembling slightly, pressed the stop button. He immediately saved the audio file, renaming it Confession, and emailed a copy to himself before uploading another to a secure cloud storage account. He created 2 backups. This digital witness was too precious to lose. He stumbled back inside, his legs caked with dirt, his shirt stiff with dried sweat. He didn't have the energy to shower. He collapsed onto his couch, the recording of Carol's voice echoing in his head. "So many liens on this property you'll have to sell. Bob and I will make sure the architectural committee rejects every offer. You've made an enemy of the whole neighborhood. We always win." She had given him the rope. All he had to do now was let her hang herself with it. For the first time in months, Mark slept soundly, a deep, dreamless sleep born of physical exhaustion and the profound relief of having a real weapon. He woke the next morning sore but resolute. The war had changed. He was no longer on the defensive, reacting to Carol's attacks. He was about to launch a counteroffensive. He spent all of Sunday at his computer. He ignored the hideous wasteland of wood chips in his backyard and the 2 threatening letters on his counter. He researched. He looked up terms like tortious interference, HOA board liability, housing discrimination, and conspiracy to commit fraud. He learned that HOA board members could, in fact, be held personally liable if they were found to have acted in bad faith or engaged in malicious conduct. Carol's friendship with the president's wife was no longer a shield. It was a link in a chain of liability that could drag them all down. By Monday morning, he knew he was out of his depth. This wasn't something he could fight with HOA bylaws and sheer stubbornness anymore. This required a professional. He searched for law firms specializing in real estate and HOA litigation. He ignored the big, flashy downtown firms and looked for a smaller, hungrier practice. He found one with stellar reviews, a firm called Albright and Associates. He called and scheduled a consultation for the next day. He walked into the modest but professional office of Ms. Eleanor Albright, feeling a nervous energy he hadn't felt since his confrontation with Carol's pool party. Ms. Albright was a woman, in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a demeanor that radiated calm competence. She listened intently as Mark recounted the entire saga, from the first unauthorized cannonball to the mountain of wood chips. She took notes, her expression neutral, asking clarifying questions but never interrupting. Mark laid out the evidence. Chronologically on her conference table, photos of Carol's parties, the bill for the new pool pump, the HOA violation letters, the city code complaints, his rejected landscaping plans, a copy of the HOA bylaws with the relevant sections highlighted. It was a pathetic-looking pile of paper, the documented history of his slow-motion harassment. "It seems," Ms. Albright said, her fingers steepled, "that you have a classic case of neighbor harassment and selective enforcement by your HOA. It's a tough fight. They have deep pockets and can drag this out until you're broke from legal fees. Your best bet is usually to comply, document everything, and maybe file a complaint with the state." Mark felt a pang of disappointment. "That's it?" "Usually," she said. "But you seem like a man who might have an ace up his sleeve. Is there anything else?" Mark took a deep breath. "Yes," he said. "There is." He took out his phone, connected it to the small speaker on the table, and pressed play. Carol's voice, laced with malice and wine, filled the quiet office. Ms. Albright's neutral expression dissolved. Her eyes widened slightly. She leaned forward, her focus absolute, as Carol laid out the entire conspiracy in her own damning words. When the recording ended, Ms. Albright hit replay and listened to the entire thing a second time. After a long silence, she looked up at Mark, and for the first time she smiled. It was a thin, predatory smile. "Mr. Davison," she said, her voice now charged with a new energy. "This changes everything. This is no longer a case of selective enforcement. This is a conspiracy to illegally depress the value of your property and interfere with its potential sale. This isn't a shield anymore. This is a sword." The strategy she laid out was swift and brutal. "We are not going to sue yet," she explained. "Lawsuits are expensive and time-consuming. First, we are going to terrify them into complete and unconditional surrender." She would draft a single, comprehensive demand letter. It would not be addressed just to Carol or Bob Vance. It would be addressed to every single member of the HOA Board of Directors, personally, at their home addresses. It would detail the full scope of the harassment, from the initial trespassing to the abuse of the HOA and city reporting systems. It would accuse Bob Vance of acting in bad faith and Carol of orchestrating a malicious campaign. "And then," Ms. Albright said, her eyes gleaming, "we will state that we are in possession of a recording in which Ms. Peters explicitly confesses to a conspiracy with Mr. Vance and members of the board to use their official positions to levy fraudulent fines, place lions on your property, and tortiously interfere with any future sale. We will make it very clear that if they do not meet our demands, our first lawsuit will name every board member personally. Their homeowner's insurance won't cover them for malicious acts. They will be on the hook for their own legal fees and for your damages, which we will claim are extensive." The demands were simple: immediate dismissal of all pending and future complaints and fines against Mark Davison, a formal written apology from the HOA board for the harassment he had endured, the immediate removal of Bob Vance from the Architectural Review Committee, a binding agreement that the HOA would approve any reasonable landscaping plan for Mark's backyard within 7 business days of submission. "We give them 48 hours to respond," Ms. Albright concluded. "We send it via certified mail and email so we know they all get it at the same time. The panic will be immediate." Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he didn't even realize he was carrying. "Do it," he said, his voice firm. The letters went out that afternoon. For 2 days, the neighborhood was silent. Mark watched from his window, but there was no unusual activity. He started to worry. Had they called his bluff? Had they circled the wagons and hired their own legal pit bull? The answer came at 7 p.m. on Thursday night. His doorbell rang. He opened it to find a man he vaguely recognized from neighborhood newsletters, Arthur Thompson, the president of the Oakwood Creek HOA. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man who usually projected an air of easy confidence. Tonight, that confidence was gone, replaced by a pale, haunted look. He was clutching a copy of Ms. Albright's letter in a white-knuckled fist. "Mr. Davison," Arthur said, his voice strained, "my apologies for the late hour. I think you and I need to have a serious conversation." Mark didn't smile. He simply nodded and stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come in, Arthur. I've been expecting you." Arthur stepped inside, his eyes darting around Mark's living room as if looking for hidden cameras. He looked out the back window at the sea of wood chips and shuddered. "Look," he began, foregoing any pleasantries. "This letter, it makes some very serious allegations." "They're not allegations, Arthur. They're facts," Mark said calmly. "And I have the proof." Arthur swallowed hard. "My wife. She knows Carol from the events committee. She said Carol was just venting, that she'd had a little too much wine. She never thought that Carol was stupid enough to confess to multiple felonies and torts to the very person she was targeting." Mark finished for him. "Neither did I. But she did." A nerve twitched in Arthur's jaw. "The board is in an uproar. Bob Vance has resigned from the committee, effective immediately. He claims Carol manipulated him. Carol is denying everything and calling you a liar." "It doesn't matter what she denies," Mark said, his voice cold as ice. "It only matters what's on the recording." Arthur deflated, sinking slightly into the plush armchair he hadn't been invited to sit in. He was a man who had treated his HOA presidency as a social stepping stone, a bit of resume padding. Now he was staring into the abyss of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit that would be his fault. "What do you want, Mark?" he asked, his voice now a desperate plea. "Tell me what you want, and I'll make it happen." The power had shifted so completely it was almost dizzying. A week ago, this man was the head of an organization that was systematically trying to ruin him. Now, he was in Mark's living room, begging. Mark leaned back, mirroring the posture Ms. Albright had taken in her office. "I want what's in the letter, Arthur. Every last word of it, and I want it by noon tomorrow. Otherwise, Ms. Albright files the lawsuit at 12:01 p.m., and when she does, she'll also send a copy of the recording to every single homeowner in this neighborhood. Let's see how Carol enjoys being an enemy of the whole neighborhood then." Arthur Thompson looked like a man who hadn't slept. The threat of personal lawsuits and public humiliation had worked on the HOA board with the speed and efficacy of a potent poison. By 10 a.m. the next morning, Mark's inbox began to chime. The first email was a scanned copy of a letter on official HOA letterhead, formally rescinding all fines and violations against his property, effective immediately. The subject line was a blunt, "Urgent," regarding property at 122 Oakwood Creek. The second email, which arrived 10 minutes later, was a formal notice of Robert Vance's resignation from the Architectural Review Committee, citing personal reasons. The third was a PDF of a legally binding resolution passed in an emergency session by the board, guaranteeing the approval of any good-faith landscaping plan submitted by Mark Davison within 7 business days. The final piece arrived not by email, but by a nervous-looking courier at 11:30 a.m. It was a single, crisp sheet of paper, signed by Arthur Thompson on behalf of the entire board. It was the apology. It was stilted, clearly drafted by a lawyer, and spoke of unfortunate misunderstandings and a breakdown in communication. It was a bloodless, corporate-style apology, but it was an apology nonetheless. It was a signed confession of their defeat. Mark laid the 4 documents out on his kitchen table. He had won. The siege was over. He didn't feel a surge of triumph or a desire to gloat. He just felt a quiet, profound sense of gravity returning to his world. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that had been his companion for months finally fell silent. He had his home back. He called Eleanor Albright to inform her of the HOA's surrender. "Excellent," she said, her voice crisp and satisfied. "They knew they were trapped. Keep these documents in a safe place. If they so much as breathe in your direction again, we sue. Now go build your garden, Mr. Davison. You've earned it." He spent the afternoon not in his backyard, but at his drafting table. He threw out his old compromised plans, the ones where he'd tried to appease the committee. He designed the garden he had truly wanted from the beginning. It was ambitious. 4 large cedar-raised beds for vegetables, a crushed granite pathway lined with lavender and rosemary, a flagstone patio with a built-in fire pit, and in the far corner, a small, elegant pergola that would one day be covered in wisteria. It was a plan born not of defiance, but of a deep desire to create something beautiful and peaceful out of a space that had been a source of conflict for so long. He submitted it to the HOA portal at 4:00 p.m. The news of the HOA's sudden reversal spread through the cul-de-sac with the speed of gossip. While Mark had not released the recording, Arthur Thompson, in his panic, had clearly been forced to explain to the other board members exactly why they were capitulating so completely. The story of Carol's recorded confession, of her conspiracy to commit fraud and devalue her neighbor's property, began to leak. The first sign of the shift was subtle. An elderly couple from down the street, who had previously offered only curt nods, stopped Mark in his driveway to admire his petunias. Sarah from across the street brought over a lemon loaf, her eyes alight with a kind of shared victory. I heard. "The queen has been dethroned," she said with a conspiratorial grin. The social chill around Carol was immediate and absolute. The neighbors who had once flocked to her pool parties now crossed the street to avoid her. Her daily power walks around the neighborhood ceased. The manicured perfection of her lawn began to look less like a point of pride and more like the desperate posturing of a fallen tyrant. She was isolated, a ghost in her own home, trapped in the silence she had tried to impose on Mark. 4 days after he submitted his plans, Mark received an email. "Your landscaping proposal has been approved." He hired a crew to remove the 10 cubic yards of wood chips, a task they accomplished in a single noisy, dusty afternoon. As they hauled away the last of the ugly mulch, Mark felt the last vestige of the battle being scraped away from his property. The blank slate was back, but this time it was filled with promise, not dread. The construction of the garden took 2 weeks. Mark worked alongside the landscapers, hauling stones, assembling the pergola, and filling the raised beds with rich, dark soil. He felt a deep restorative pleasure in the physical labor, in the act of building something positive and life-affirming. During this time, he saw Carol only once. He was kneeling in one of the new beds, crumbling soil through his fingers, when he felt eyes on him. He looked up to see her standing on her deck, watching him. Her face was pale and drawn. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. When their eyes met, she didn't scream or threaten. She just stared, her expression a toxic cocktail of hatred, disbelief, and something that looked almost like despair. Mark held her gaze for a moment, then deliberately turned his back and went back to his work, offering her nothing. No anger, no acknowledgement, just indifference. It was the cruelest cut of all. By late summer, the transformation was complete. The garden was a riot of life. Tomato vines, heavy with red and yellow fruit, climbed their stakes. Zucchini and cucumber. Plants sprawled across the soil. The air was fragrant with the scent of basil, mint, and lavender. Bees hummed among the flowers, and the pergola already had the first tentative tendrils of wisteria climbing its posts. One warm evening, Mark sat on his new flagstone patio, a cold beer in his hand, watching the sunset paint the sky. The fire pit glowed with a gentle warmth. Sarah and her husband were over, sharing a bowl of fresh salsa made from his garden's tomatoes. "You know," Sarah's husband said, looking around the idyllic space, "I have to admit, I was skeptical. But this is a definite improvement to the neighborhood." Mark smiled. "I think so, too." It was then that he noticed the sign. It had been hammered into Carol's lawn earlier that day, a stark, professional sign with a realtor's glossy photo on it. For sale. The war was well and truly over. She had tried to force him out, to ruin him, to take his home. Instead, she had lost her own. She had been so consumed with destroying his peace that she had shattered hers in the process. He raised his bottle in a silent, solitary toast. It wasn't a toast to victory, but to the quiet, simple, and profound justice of the harvest. He had sown defiance and resilience, and in the end, he had reaped peace. And as the last light of day faded, leaving the garden bathed in the soft glow of the fire pit, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that it was the sweetest harvest he had ever known.